Hello, and welcome to another episode of Casual Learning. I'm your host, John Bannan. What's the deal with an infinite universe? Is the universe infinite? The answer is no, it's not. So, how can I say that? How do I know that that's the fact? Well, one of the first things you can point out is that if the universe were infinite in size, then and you took a rocket ship and you started flying in some particular direction. And regardless of how fast you went, there would always be a part of the universe that remained an infinite distance away that you could never travel to. So, if the universe were in fact infinite in size, because you could never get there, the fact that it's infinite in size would be unknowable. You couldn't know that it was infinite in size because you could never go everywhere in an infinitely large universe to prove that it was infinite in size. So, whether the universe is infinite, first point is, it's not knowable. It's not a knowable thing. It is known that the universe is finite in size. We know that. This room is finite in size. I know you can prove knowledge of finite sizes. But there's no way to prove something is infinite in size because you can never go the full extent of the infinity to prove that it's there. So it's not knowable. So what is known is that things are finite in size. What is not knowable is that things are infinite in size. It's not knowable. Now I'm going to make a slightly more complicated argument to prove to you why things are not infinite. Now, when you think about infinities, you can think about various things having the characteristic of being infinite. Now, you can think of time being infinite. And I've already done videos proving to you that that's an impossibility. There can't be an infinite regression in time due to the beginningless time paradox. But you can also think of other things as being infinite, such as the size and scope, the size of the universe. You can think of that as being infinite. Or you could think of the microscopic world and things being infinitely small. That is, you can continuously cut things in half into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces, and it just goes on infinitely. So there's different ways of looking at infinity in terms of size and minutia, how small things could be. And infinities don't exist, period, in reality. They don't. They exist in mathematics, but mathematics is an idea, and mathematics does not necessarily represent reality. So you could have mathematical models that deal with infinities or infinite sets, but that doesn't prove that reality is also infinite. It doesn't prove it at all. So don't confuse mathematical models with reality. They can be two very separate things. So, well, let's think about, can things be divided into smaller and smaller pieces to an infinitely small extent? And the answer is no, they can't be. Let's think about this simple example. Think about two things that are going to hit each other. One's being pushed into another thing. Right? So think about two cue balls or something like that. So you got this one thing, and it's going to move in that direction and strike this thing. Now, cue ball A is going to strike cue ball B. Well, in order for that movement to happen, and the subcomponents of cue ball A also have to move. So you think, well, this has got subcomponents in it too, right? Subcomponents. And there's a string of them too from each surface of the object. So in order for cue ball A to move and strike cue ball B, well, the series of subcomponents also has to move. So, but it moves in a sequence. So you got to have this subcomponent, right? It has to move and hit that one, and that one has to move and hit that one. And this one has to move and hit that one, and this one has to move and hit that one, and that one has to move and hit that one, and that one has to move and hit that one. So you have a series of subcomponents also moving in order for the larger object to move. Well, you can continue to say this about the subcomponents of the subcomponents themselves. So you say, well, okay, these subcomponents also have to move. But, you know, this subcomponent, well, let's pick this one. This subcomponent over here, the subcomponents of that subcomponent also have to move in order for this large cue ball A to strike B. So you got subcomponents in this little guy here, right? Little subcomponents here. And they all have to move and strike each other as well. So they got to move in order for the whole thing to move. See? And you can continue to do this infinitely. Keep saying, well, the subcomponents of the subcomponents of the subcomponents also have to move. And they have to move in a sequential order in order for the entire object to move itself. Well, the problem is, if you can continuously divide subcomponents infinitely into smaller and smaller and smaller units, that would result in the reality that nothing could move at all, because all your time would be taken up in the infinite number of subcomponents making a movement in order for the larger object to move. And there isn't enough time. It would take an infinite amount of time for an infinite amount of subcomponents to move in order to move the larger object. So things would not be able to move if you could divide subcomponents infinitely. There'd be no such thing as movement. And if there's no such thing as movement in a material sense, then the thing itself doesn't exist. Because all things move. All material things that are real move. They move. That's what defines their existence. That's how you even know they're there. If they didn't move, they never moved. You wouldn't know they're there. They couldn't be there. So, because things move, it has to be the case that you cannot have an infinite subdivision of subcomponents of larger components, because we know the larger components move. Therefore, we know there can't be an infinite division of subcomponents. So you cannot divide things infinitely smaller and smaller and smaller. And in fact, physicists accept this idea, and they refer to an indivisible unit of matter. Now, that indivisible unit of matter tends to get smaller, but that doesn't prove that it's infinitely small. And for this logical reason that things move, this is proof that there is an indivisible unit of matter. There is a size at which matter can no longer get any smaller. It can't be divided anymore. Otherwise, movement itself would be impossible, because there wouldn't be enough time in an infinite amount of time for anything to move. Okay, so in terms of minutiae and things getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Infinity is impossible. It's impossible. Things wouldn't exist if things could be divided into infinitely smaller and smaller pieces. Movement would not be possible. Material things wouldn't exist. Now, interestingly, you can make the same exact argument in terms of the argument that the universe itself is infinite in terms of size, because this argument is not size dependent. This argument applies to the smallest things, but it also applies to the largest things. So this argument also proves that the universe itself cannot be infinitely large because things move. See, in an infinitely large space or universe, you can imagine an infinitely large thing, such as a cue ball, for instance. There's, in an infinitely large space, theoretically, there's no reason why there couldn't be an infinitely large thing. So the question is it possible for something to be infinitely large? And the answer is no, because that thing couldn't move. And if it doesn't move, it doesn't exist. It's not possible. Because an infinitely large thing would also have infinitely smaller subcomponents. And in order for that infinitely larger thing to move, those infinitely smaller subcomponents would all have to move first in sequence in order for the thing to move. Well, because there's an infinitely small number of subcomponents, it would take an infinite amount of time for all those infinite subcomponents to move in order for the larger, infinitely large object to move. But we know that that's impossible because you don't have an infinite amount of time for that to happen. And therefore, movement would be impossible for an infinitely large object. Therefore, there can't be an infinitely large object. It couldn't move. Therefore, there can't be an infinitely large space. Because if there were an infinitely large space, that would mean an infinitely large object were possible, because there's an infinite amount of space in which for it to exist. So such a thing is theoretically possible. An infinitely large object would be theoretically possible in an infinitely large space, but such an object couldn't move. So it's not possible. That means that the universe itself cannot be infinitely large. It can't be, because the largest objects couldn't move. That means it don't exist. That means the space itself doesn't exist. There's no reason why a larger and larger object would not be possible, no logical reason, in an infinitely large space. But since an infinitely large object couldn't move, then that means the infinitely large space is also impossible. It's impossible. So the conclusion is, in terms of infinities, infinities do not exist. They are not real. And I know some scientists will claim that the universe is infinite, and that's just not true. And there's no proof that it is. And some people will claim that you can keep dividing things into smaller and smaller pieces. And that's not true either. And there's no scientific proof that that's true. There's no scientific proof at all that the universe is infinite in size. And there's no scientific proof at all that you can subdivide to an infinite scale. There's no such proof. There's no scientific proof for that at all. And logically, those things are impossibilities. They're impossibilities. And I don't care who the scientist is or physicist who's claiming that these things are real, that infinities are real. They're wrong. They're impossibilities, logical impossibilities. And ask them, if you still, still don't believe me, ask them to show you one. Show me something that's infinite in size or scope. And they can't. There's nothing that they can show you. No way. There's no way they can do it. And as I said earlier, infinities, even if it did exist, which it can't logically, but even if it did, it would be unknowable. Unknowable. So you're really talking about something that just doesn't exist. And if it did, you couldn't prove it existed anyway. So there's my proof as to why infinities are not real. Don't believe in them. They're not real. All right. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below, and I'll answer them. And please press the subscribe button. I appreciate it. And I hope you learned something. And I know there's a lot of people who believe in these infinities. The universe is infinite, or you can go infinitely smaller. And that's all nonsense. It's logically impossible. It's not true. All right. Take care.